Hey folks, Jeff Salzman here, and welcome back to the Daily Evolver. Today, I am joined by David Loye, the author of what I consider to be a beautiful and significant new book in the integral world. It's called Rediscovering Darwin, the rest of Darwin's theory and why we need it today. I am also joined by Rianne Eisler, and I have to say a little starstruck because, Rianne, your book, The Chalice and the Blade, was what a big book for me and for all of my friends back at whatever it was, the late 80s, where you laid out ideas of cultural evolution and talked about the integration of masculine and feminine principles. And I can still feel the thrill of that book. So it's great to have you with us. And I guess it's on its 56th printing, well-deserved. And so the surprise and secret here is that David and Rianne are married. And I am happy to have you both. Thank you for coming to the Daily Evolver.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, so Rianne, you're going to be here as backup. And we're going to talk about David's book, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about you, David, in a second here. But David, you're 93 years old.
Yes,
you've been working on this for most of your professional life, and I really appreciate you coming on the show.
30 years, and I should explain that I've been sailing under false colors up to this point because I've been passing myself off as 93 now for 6 months. I'll actually be 93 day after tomorrow.
Oh, really?
Yes. So I'm but being 93, I have a tendency to get all wound up and go off. And then I can't remember where I'm going. She's here. One reason she's here is to jump in and save me. Like all of a sudden I'm off the lock into the water. I'm drowning, and she reaches down, pulls me out.
But I love this book. I think it's a very important contribution, especially at this time when we're seeing such a regression worldwide, really, certainly in this country. And so I want to be here with my wonderful partner.
Right on.
Now.
40 years together.
Is that right? Wow. Well, congratulations on that, and happy birthday, David.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I was 52 when I met her. She was 36. 46.
Why don't we go on to the interview?
Okay.
Yeah, let me just give my listeners a little more background on you, David.
Okay.
So David is a psychologist, an evolutionary system scientist. This is a high-end guy here. He's written 30 books, including Darwin's Lost Theory. He is a former member of the faculty at both the Princeton and UCLA Schools of Medicine. And he is best known for his fight to update and expand evolutionary theory following his discovery of the long-buried rest of Darwin's theory, the part that emphasizes love, morality, and spirituality as higher order drivers of evolution, and to break the fixation that modern science has on the survival of the fittest and the selfish gene part of the teaching. So part of your thesis also, David, is that by ignoring this part of Darwin's teaching, we have created, and I love how you put this, a hole in the modern mind that is pernicious, and that integrating this moral and spiritual aspect of Darwin's teaching is what we need to move to the next stage of evolution, a more healthy, humane, exciting world, all that good stuff. So maybe we start there, David, with you unpacking a little bit of these two parts of Darwin's theory and the half that is being rediscovered and brought forward in your work.
Just let me quickly comment on we're spotting the hole in the head of modern mind. For the first time, I've heard somebody recognize how apt that is. No, Darwin's theory, the rest of Darwin's theory falls in place like this. There is we're familiar with the first half, which is comes from Origin of Species. and it's been degraded into survival of the fittest and so on, and then selfish genes and so on. And but the second half, that's what I was finding, was that there are two halves there. And how I found it was we were both members. We were actually co-founders with Erwin Laszlo of the General Evolution Research Group. We were meeting secretly in Budapest during the Cold War with Russia and the United States, playing nuclear chicken game. And we didn't, at least I didn't know what was happening. I mean, I didn't know why they wanted me. And we got there. Turned out that what Laszlo was proposing was that we should, he says there are all kinds of problems with the present theory of evolution. What we should do is see if we can come up with a positive slant that will drop this survival of the fittest thing that's destroying us, a positive thing. And that's what we set out to do. After we had been about 10 years at this with other scientists involved internationally in the General Evolution Research Group, I came to the conclusion we weren't getting anywhere. I thought to myself, what would Darwin think of this? And I thought, who do I know that even reads Darwin anymore? And so I had a computerized disc of the Descent of Man, and I started into it. And the first thing I discovered was, I thought, well, I'm going to feed the machine this familiar phrase, survival of the fittest. How many times did he write about survival of the fittest? He only wrote twice in the whole book. One time to say, in a sense, I'm sorry I ever used this thing.
Yeah.
I thought to myself, now what's the exact opposite of survival of the fittest? Well, something like love, and put in love. Bing, bing, 95 times. 95 times he's writing about love in the Descent of Man. And with only a single entry in the index, this is how they actually blanked out on anything to do with love. And then, my God, what's going on here? And I thought, well, I'll try selfishness. Selfishness. That runs all through this, fouling people up. And I got 6 times. I thought, well, what's the episode of selfishness? Something like altruism, something moral, something doing with the moral sense. So I put that in. He's writing 92 times about the moral sense, the need for it. He even has, I even have quotes of his where he's saying, in effect, this is it. The struggle for existence drops away. And at our level of advancement, the moral thing is the top thing. And well, anyway, that was part of the lost. In other words, it's so ironic, so strange. The people that put together the neo-Darwinian formation in the great, known as the Great Synthesis in 1942, led by Julian Huxley, they had focused on what did they focus on?
Well, on genetics, because when Darwin wrote, we didn't have the knowledge about the genetic factor involved, but actually Dobzhansky did write about cultural evolution. And I just want to add, darling, that really what's so exciting about this book and about the other works that David Loye has published in this area is that truly the book dealing with human evolution, which he called Descent of Man, right, has been ignored. And this is a terrible thing because even the first part has largely been, as David said, degraded, because survival of the fittest has been interpreted as survival of the meanest, nastiest, the most selfish. But as Darwin emphasized again and again in Descent of Man, with human evolution, you really have to move to cultural evolution. And I'm going to let you continue.
Let me put this first half, second half thing in context historically. The first half out of Origin of Species is by now well established. It's more than well established. The second half is that's the rest of Darwin that was buried, has been ignored by and large for 100 years. But the fascinating thing to me behind the scenes as a scientist is that the first half, it was biologists. They were all biologists. They didn't know anything about cultural evolution. They didn't know anything about social science and so on. They were strictly restricted to biological evolution.
Well, they were materialists, David, right? I mean, they just wanted to work with things they could measure and...
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. But the second half, see, Darwin moved on. He moved way beyond them. He moved so far beyond them that I discovered in the Darwins, in the Descent of Man, evidence of the roots of self-organizing theories, one of the hottest things in science today, plus even one of the principles of chaos theory. And anyway, in a way,
all right. The most important thing is the point that you're making, which is that basically, even though, and I wish you would talk about Romanes, because Romanes was a disciple, very, very close disciple.
Right. Well, let me just see, because I read the book and I found it very, really influential. It really has made me think differently about this. And Darwin's first and maybe most famous book is Origin of the Species, where he talks about evolution really up to man, is what you point out, up to humanity. And then years later wrote The Descent of Man, which is about the evolution of humanity, more focused on that. And it's in this second book, The Descent of Man, that this moral principle and the love and spirituality is seen as drivers of evolution. Right?
Yeah.
And so then his and that was ignored almost immediately. And his biggest disciple complained about that and pointed that out, but it really didn't fix itself. And so maybe talk about that a little bit.
Oh yeah, no, the man known as Darwin's disciple, George Romanes, worked very close with Darwin for the last several years of his life, and he went on to become a famous British psychologist. The neo-Darwinian, they already were neo-Darwinian. They were shaping Darwin into the neo-Darwinian theory, so-called. Literally on his deathbed, he came down with cancer, and he wrote this whole book. On his deathbed, he was just completing it, in which he says, "Who are these neo-Darwinians that are taking Darwin and putting in their own ideas and claiming it's his and distorting him?" And he went on and on. He was just turned. In my book, I characterize him as the first example of the gate breakers. In other words, the neo-Darwinians are the classic gatekeepers. We're now in the hands of the gatekeepers. The gate breakers is the group that includes everybody listening to this, includes you, includes us. And the irony is that literally everything in the second half of that thing was dropped out of what was told to us as this is an evolution theory.
Mm-hmm. Well, it seems to me that we just went through a phase of materialism where we couldn't hear it. We didn't have receptors for that. We wanted to get rid of religion.
I would say that it's more than materialism, because the social science also uses empirical data. It was really, what do you study? And do you only study the biological, or do you really take into account what Darwin himself had to say about what happens with human evolution, where culture, that human creation we call culture, plays such a vital role?
So why don't you sort of lay that out for us a little bit about what Darwin said about how culture evolves, and what are the mechanisms and how these higher order principles actually work?
Well, he actually, in the later part of my research, identified what I call the 5 major or the 5 prime factors in the rest of Darwin's theory, and they are these, and notice how the things I'm describing are actually what Ken, what we resonate to are working at. The first one was sex. He had a new take on sex, which I can explain more later about when we get all 5 out. Sex. The next one was love. There's this concept that's been in every theory of evolution from at least Empedocles in Greek through Jesus on. Love. And it comes to our time, and neo-Darwinians don't even mention it. They put one entry in a book that has 95 times writing about love. Then another one was the community. They call it, in his day, they called it mutual aid, working together for the good of all. And he was insisting that was part of the thing. And then his chief attempt at saving us from ourselves, the moral sense. He developed the concept of the moral sense. And that is particularly interesting to me, because he was the first to provide a scientific basis for something that was only articulated up to that point in philosophy and in the humanities. And then came a really bombshell, in a way. Here is all this stuff about the big gulf, the battle between science and religion, and there's no point in going into it because everybody's familiar with it. But he writes about spirituality. Here is a man who before he went on the voyage to the Beagle, was in the divinity studies at Cambridge. And here he is, and he's writing about. He doesn't refer to that, but he's writing about the function. The function of both religion and spirituality, that this was necessary for evolution of our species. He did not believe in God, but he was a Unitarian in his time. Actually, his whole family were Unitarians.
Yeah, and he also had this. I love a quote that you put in your book from Darwin, where he's talking about the future perfection, and I'll quote it. You say, this is from Darwin. He says, "Looking to future generations, this is where we're going. There's no cause to fear that the social instincts will grow weaker. and we may expect that virtuous habits will grow stronger. In this case, the struggle between our higher and lower impulses will be less severe, and virtue will be triumphant. I love that. That sounds like me.
Well, but it's unfortunately, but now it's hard to believe. By now, 2 world wars, Hitler, and now it's hard to believe that. See, Darwin was in the 19th century. They were looking forward with great hopes for the 20th century.
Right.
They were selling the idea that everything that's bad in the 19th century here is going to be done away with. It's going to be utopia in the 20th century, and everybody knows what we got in the 20th.
Right.
Well, except if I may say, yes, we've had some massive regressions in the 20th and 21st century, but slavery is no longer considered acceptable. Public executions and torture are no longer considered acceptable. Child labor is, at least many parts of the world, no longer considered acceptable. I mean, if you really look, there has been movement in the direction.
Well, and particularly since World War II, in the developed world, there was just this massive long peace of, decrease in violence and decrease in poverty. I mean, there's a lot of, as you say, there's a lot of evidence of that sort of moral movement.
Yes.
But yeah, these regressions are brutal.
Yes, they are.
And I could see where it's so interesting, David. God bless you, man. I mean, for somebody who's in the evolutionary movement, the integral movement, you are a living piece of history. You were back with this Budapest Club with Ervin Laszlo, where you're sneaking behind the Iron Curtain and thinking these heretical thoughts. And this is our heritage, and I want to honor you and appreciate you for that. And still bringing it forward at age 92 and a half.
Well, thank you. The reason that I'm rather pessimistic right now is that I am also a World War II veteran, married to a Holocaust survivor. And
good Lord.
What gets me is I see all the evidence of the move toward fascism. The authoritarians taking over one country after another. Now the big test here in this country is, are we going to get rid of the precursor of the big time authoritarians and go on? See, I pray that Darwin was right, that long term, once we get through this downturn, that we're going to pull together and strive and do more than survive, achieve, fulfill. See, that's what haunts me.
Yeah.
Darwin is showing is that we are programmed. There's this book by Kettler, Born to be Good. We are. And there's been this historical battle between religion, within the religious denominations, between the view that we're born good or we're born bad. And the born good, all the evidence for born good is so massive. We have this vast potential, and we keep getting bypassed, shoved off us into these regressions that we're going through right now.
Well, and as you point out, when you sort of create these 3 big categories of people who are dealing with these ultimate questions. One is the neo-Darwinists. One is, I think you call them the super neos.
Yeah.
And then the creationists.
Yeah.
And that still it is just the conventional wisdom in science. With Dawkins and the selfish gene and Daniel Dennett and these guys, is that I'll read a quote that you put in your book from Dawkins, and it sums it up. You present it as it sums it up, and I think you're right. And here's what Dawkins says. He says, "Nature is not cruel, only pitilessly indifferent. This is one of the hardest lessons for humans to learn. We cannot admit that things might be neither good nor evil, neither cruel nor kind, but simply callously indifferent to all suffering, lacking in all purpose. Not very inspiring.
No, and that's the bunch that have been grinding out literally thousands of titles. Dawkins, an awfully good writer, incredibly prolific, but in a way, they've been selling poison they pretty much taken over the availability for publishing. I mean, our side, the great gate breakers, we can get in here and there. Ken got his great boost from the Shambhala. We can get in there, but it's peripheral in relation to them. They're catering to the mainstream need unfortunately, for big investment in keeping the idea of the survival of the fittest alive.
It's interesting. I agree, and it's still very much the dominant thinking in science. And but I was reading Steven Pinker, his new book Enlightenment Now, where he argues for the Enlightenment values, not spiritual enlightenment. But even he's like, I hate to think that there is some sort of moral arc to the universe, but it appears that there is. And so, I could see a little bit of cognitive dissonance in some of these hard scientists that may be the harbinger of, breaking loose this, contraction around, basically the exteriors.
Yeah, I get into that aspect of the super neos. There are all these negative aspects. And I have one of the most brutal quotes about the super neos when they got underway. I'll even read it to you if you want. But
yeah, do.
Okay, this is the attitude that they got underway with. It's became the most infamous quote from the Super Neo, Rise of the Super Neos.
We're talking the Super Neo-Darwinists.
Yeah.
Yes.
Given a full chance to act in his own interests, nothing but expediency will restrain him from brutalizing, from maiming, from murdering his brother, his mate, or his child. Scratch an altarist and watch a hypocrite bleed. No hint of genuine charity ameliorates our vision of society once sentimentalism has been laid aside.
Wow.
But
I love that. Scratch an altruist and see a hypocrite bleed.
See, to go on to Pinker, though, in my book, I go into great depth on the bad side of the super neos, sociologists, evolutionary psychologists. But I also point out that there's hope. Hope they're going to grow up enough to get away from what they're manufacturing. I refer to both Tinker and Sam Harris. Sam Harris, brilliant guy, fighting religion, tooth and nail, and so on.
Right.
But he is identified with the super neos. They have started writing with understanding of the moral sense. I see that from what you quote that Pinker is a little uncomfortable with.
Right. Yeah, and Sam Harris is, I don't know if it's his latest book, but it's just not more than a couple years old. It's called Waking Up.
Yeah.
It's about spiritual waking up. Now, he doesn't see it as being anything that's beyond the brain or anything like that, but at least they're working in that territory and trying to break out of this suffocating, scientism.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I think the tide is beginning to turn. And I think that not only the names that were just mentioned, but a lot of social biologists and certainly quite a number of evolutionary psychologists, primatologists, etc., are beginning to talk. And I'm actually writing about that in my new book, which will be out next year. But I do want to say here that I think what David is doing in this book is a very, very important contribution to turning the tide. Because we really have to start with how the originator of evolutionary theory that is today considered, gospel, has been so misinterpreted.
I know, isn't that something?
Yeah, so I really want to say that this is a very important part.
Yeah.
Turning of the tide.
Yeah.
What I see is, how is this book going to be received? Where is it going? Will it just be? See, for instance, the whole idea of Darwin's. Oh yes! Oh, there it is! Oh, what a beautiful.
Isn't this beautiful? I have to talk so the screen goes to me. Rediscovering Darwin: The Rest of Darwin's Theory and Why We Need It Today. David Loye. Available at Amazon and everywhere else.
The screen isn't going to you. Here it is.
Oh, there it is. Okay, good.
There it is. And
hold it into the screen right there.
Oh yeah, and see that ship going and see the clouds. There's Darwin young and Darwin old and the cloudy. It's a gloomy setting, but this bright ship is going there. That's what I see. We're the world of challenge, the world of downfall. But that golden ship is us.
Yeah,
it's us if we wake up. But,
well, let's talk about that. So let's say that your book is successful, influential, and your work has been all along. What does bringing back this moral sense, spirituality, love into the evolutionary framework do? How does that, apply to our challenges? You've talked about supersynthesis. How do you see it, David?
Well, I see that. The question is, what's going to happen to this book? What's going to happen to anybody that's trying to push the rest of Darwin, no matter how much it makes sense? But I see over and over people get very enthusiastic. They see, oh boy, this is really great. But it doesn't last. They're all busy. They all have their own agendas, and it's not getting reinforcement. This book, the hope, as I see it, is if this book gets enough support to have some weight, where then the people get enthusiastic, and then they look over and they say, "Well, so and so is." The book opens with Wilbur and Laszlo and Chick Haley and others raving about it.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you have some pretty darn amazing testimonials here from people all over the place who think that this is an immensely important book, puts together a giant jigsaw puzzle, revolutionizes current evolutionary theory. I mean, people, I think, are responding to this book. Yeah. By the looks of the pre-publication reviews.
Yeah, but see, the central thing that I want to get across is that the gatekeepers have the monopoly on evolution theory at this point, and the significance of bringing Darwin's lost theory and Darwin's buried half to the surface is that they have taken over Darwin. They've taken over the power. If they say blah, 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 well, see, that's Darwinian and so on. The beauty of this thing is it can give us, Darwin shifts from them to us as our 900-pound gorilla. It gives us the force. We can, all we integralists and all other people within our orientation, we can work our off and go only so far. But if we can also claim the big name in evolution, we've got a chance to I think, to survive it.
Well, it's all right there. I mean, you have brought it to light. I mean, it's in Darwin's words, and very beautiful. You know, I mean, I love, even where he talks about the animals and how it's real appreciation for beauty that is behind the female choice of mating with the male. And she finds his song beautiful, not just, signifying suitability and survival, but she loves the colors of his feathers, and that love and is built into the evolutionary matrix. It's built into the evolutionary erotic flow.
Yeah. See,
hallelujah.
In Darwin, where he was going on that. See, a lot of people have just thrown out all that out. They just, those are just little charming animal stories. That's just Winnie the Pooh. So forth. What he's writing over and over and over again is the power of love at the level preceding us that is in our hands now, and we're not using it adequately. But see, he was also he's considered. He's been charged with being a sexist, And the interesting thing that I discovered was that he was sneaking in these little commentaries that were anti-macho. I've got one here that I love. Let me just take it. It'll just take a second here. But it was, in a sense, where is it?
For you. I do want to say that he was sexist. He reflected his time. But at the same time, and that's what's so interesting about Darwin, he also had a real appreciation for the so-called feminine qualities that men, of course, also have, but that our socialization suppresses and distorts, and therefore of women. And there is your...
I am absolutely flabbergasted.
Why are you flabbergasted?
This is typical.
Well, let me find it for you.
No, you won't find it because apparently it isn't there. This is typical. I am cursed because I'm exploring this time and after time when I make one step forward.
It's right here.
Where?
The curse has been lifted.
Oh, here it is. Here it is. You saw who found it.
I did.
Yeah.
Rianne found it.
Oh, I'll tell you, she's
and the curse has been lifted. So share it with us, David.
I like to list curses.
His interesting thing, his take on sex was this. The standard mainstream neo-Darwinian thing is pretty much sex is just simply, the sex thing, mating, and it's your fitness component. Your fitness component is how many children you're going to sire. That's all they're interested in as far as sex goes. And but Darwin was saying, look, fellas, there's more to it. There is a other dimension here that you get into when you consider the differences between male and female. but there are nuances here that really matter. Here's what he said. He says, woman seems to differ from man in mental disposition, chiefly in her greater tenderness and less selfishness. Man is the rival of other men. He delights in competition, and this leads to ambition, which passes too easily into selfishness.
And I think, of course, he's describing the male stereotype, the masculine stereotype, that was even stronger in his time.
Right.
And also, here's another one that is this is an example of his anti-macho stance. He says, or she may accept, as appearances would sometimes lead us to believe, not the male which is most attractive to her, but the one which is the least distasteful.
Well, I think that's a rather snide remark.
No.
I don't know that that's accurate.
Well, I like the one where you put here, let's see. If female birds had been incapable of appreciating the beautiful colors, ornaments, voices of their male partners, all the labor and anxiety exhibited by the latter, the males, in displaying their charms before the females would have been thrown away. And that's impossible to contemplate.
That was his big thing. One of his, besides natural selection, the big thing for him was sexual selection.
Yeah.
That was just ignored for a long time.
Well, the Victorians weren't going to go for female sexual selection too much, let's face it.
But I want to say something here, which is, this is bringing, not only does David Loye's book bring Darwin to life, but he also shows his humanity. I mean, which so few books on evolution until now have done. I mean,
yeah.
That the tide is beginning to change, which does not mean that we will get rid of the resistance. Because really, if you think about the neo-Darwinians or the social biologists, etc., who have taken this negative view, it's the same view of human nature as the original sin one.
Yeah, and we're fallen in some way.
It's an ideological bias.
Yeah.
And I think that one of the main things that you bring up is that Darwin, strangely and wonderfully, did not share this bias.
Right.
And I think that's so important.
Let me give you one little anecdote. Darwin was actually a precursor of Social Security. In his time, in his community, a little town of Down near London, he was actually, here's the greatest scientist living then. He was employed also as a local magistrate. This one scientist who was visiting wrote about how, I think it was Romanes visiting, marveled that in the middle of the scientific discussion they were having, Darwin had to switch as a magistrate and decide where a pig could cross the road. But the one thing I love is this. He was very concerned about the boom-bust cycle in capitalism, where everybody's thrown out of work, and then there's work, and then they're thrown out, and so on. And so what he put in the Down Friends Club, he collected money and in turn invested. He was a very sharp businessman. He invested that money and he collected money from the citizens there. And then when the crash came, they would distribute it. See, so it was like an early form of Social Security.
Mm-hmm.
He was a just all around lovable guy.
Yeah.
I loved reading your book because it is so fascinating and so accessible.
Yeah. Yeah, me too. Yeah. Go on, Rianne. I'm sorry.
No, I mean, I just wanted to bring that out because I think when people hear Darwin and evolution, they think it's going to be something really dry. But it's really almost like a detective story.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's what I actually extra love about this book is, first of all, it's not that super long. You can actually read it in a couple sittings, and it not only brings forth this humanity of Darwin himself and this humane second half of his teaching that really has been left out. But you tell it as a detective story, David. You tell it as how it was revealed to you over your really decades of contemplating this and working with the really cool people in our lineage. And I learned a lot, just even about the history of my own thinking.
This is all such music to my ears because while I was writing it, I had to continually think, dare I do this? I better not. And then I'd think, well, hell, I'm in my 90s now. It doesn't matter. I'm just going to say what I think, and that comes through.
It does indeed.
Very much so. Yeah, and so a really the book pulls you through. So anyway, I think we're about out of time, a little over time, actually. All good. That's a great thing about the internet. They don't really stop you.
Right.
So, but I want to thank you so much, David, first of all, for your life's work, and particularly for this book, Rediscovering Darwin, and for joining us on the Daily Evolver. And Rianne Eisler, to meet you finally is just a real honor. And I'm looking forward to what's next from you as well.
It's been a pleasure. Been a pleasure. And I just, as I said, I'm just here because I think this is a fabulous book.
Yes, well, I agree. And so, yes, thanks again, everybody. David, was there one other thing you wanted to say?
Yes, I want to say that you're part of something that is astounding. Not only Wilbur's work, which is revolutionary and it's going to last. I was turned on first by the Atman Project, and that's going to last. But the team that he's built, all these people into foreign countries that are using the integral approach and bringing it on. There's nothing comparable to what you're doing.
Yeah. I mean, I'm so thrilled to be able to do it and to highlight how people are using integral theory to make a more complete, humane world. That's what's next, I hope. So it's my great honor.
Thanks.
All right. Well, thank you again, David Loye and Rianne Eisler. And thank you, everybody, for listening to the Daily Evolver, and check back for the next episode. Bye, folks.